the New York Central Hudson. These locomotives were 464 Hudson types, although some places actually refer to them as Baltic types. New York Central, it was Hudson, after the Hudson River. And they were one of the most famous locomotives in the United States. They were built in 3 different series from 1927 to 1938 by Alco and Lima. They're probably most famous for their distinctive streamlining, although many were used without that. A total of 275 were produced, and they were separated by their series, J1, J2, and J3. They had impressive tractive effort at 41,860 pounds, and they had a maximum speed, well, official maximum speed of 123 miles per hour. That's nearly 198 kilometers an hour. And that top is considered questionable. It's possible they could have gone a lot faster than that, even breaking the speed record set by the Mallard, though there's no concrete evidence that ever occurred. It's just something people think they could have done. They were built due to a demand issue. The railway's Pacific's 462s weren't powerful enough to keep up with the demand, so they needed something bigger. Though they weren't perfect, they were actually really bad with low speeds, known to be difficult at starting, but when they got going, goodness, they were amazing! But the end of steam proved to be the end of the Hudsons. Every single one of them was scrapped, and that was due to New York Central's president, Alfred E. Perlman. Yeah, if you've been watching my videos, you know where we're going with this. Where on earth is that last Hudson? I want it evaporated from this dimension. Sir, why do you have to... Can't we just give the museum just one? I'm just saying, just one. No, that is far too many. One is too many. One is too many. All the steam engines must be destroyed. What's a steam engine? Barry, I swear to you, if you ask that question one more time, the last Hudson, gentlemen! Locate it for me. My chainsaw is getting hungry. I really need a new job. I really need to know what a steam engine is. I hate you so much. Perlman is often construed as being very pro-scrapping, even by myself due to the running joke. But, to be fair, a lot of it had to do with New York Central's financial difficulties. Scrapping didn't really give them a lot of money, but it was some money, and the railway needed it. That's how Perlman saw it. They were considered obsolete, and he wanted to get as much money out of them as possible, and donating it to a museum just wasn't seen as profitable at all. From a business perspective, it makes sense, but unfortunately it resulted in every single last Hudson being destroyed. Though, believe it or not, 2 almost escaped. A pair of J1D Class Hudsons, 5311 and 5313, were actually sold to a different railway, Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo, in 1948. They were renumbered 501 and 502. However, TH&B also decided to scrap them in 1954, so sadly, they didn't get away either. However, they did keep around one remnant of the Hudsons. 502's tender was retained and converted to a steam generator car for use on their passenger trains. That generator car is still around, and it's located at the Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So, while the Hudsons themselves are all gone, one tender is a sole survivor of what are arguably one of the most famous types of locomotives ever to run in North America. The Louisville and Nashville Class M1. These 284s are sometimes referred to as Berkshires, although Chesapeake and Ohio called them Kanawhas, so whatever. They were built during and after World War II for dual service. They were actually nicknamed Big Emmas by their crews, and they were built in 3 batches between 1942 and 1949. These ones were built by Baldwin at first, and then eventually Lima. 42 were produced, and they proved themselves to be exceptional at pretty much any job they were given. Their tractive effort was 65,290 pounds. Very impressive for a locomotive with just a single set of driving wheels. The Big Emmas were put on pretty much everything. Fast freight trains, coal trains around eastern Kentucky, passenger trains between Cincinnati, Ohio and Corbin, Kentucky, just wherever, it didn't matter. They regularly hauled trains in excess of 8,000 tons, and they were well liked by their crews, but since they're on this list, you know now that Every single one of them wound up being destroyed. Even by the time the last batch of them was delivered from Lima, the L&N Railway was investing more in diesel power, and the first batch was retired in December of 1950, with the final two being retired by November of 1956, which is when steam officially ended on that railroad. They were all scrapped by the following year. But much like the Hudsons, their tenders actually survived for quite a while, used for maintenance of way service. Some of them were actually converted into canteens to supply extra water for other steam locomotives that were being used in mainline excursion service. To date, apparently at least 2 of these tenders is actually still around. 1966 is at the Southeastern Railway Museum in Duluth, Georgia, and 1984 is at the Kentucky Railway Museum in New Haven, Kentucky. The New York Central Niagaras, 484 Northern type steam locomotives that were named after the Niagara Falls! The Niagaras are distinctive as many consider them some of the best steam locomotives built ever in the entire world, period. They were actually meant to be a successor to the Hudson, as in the mid-1940s when they were built, 27 between 1945 and 1946, the trains were getting longer and the Hudsons were starting to struggle. So they needed something even bigger. The Niagaras could sustain 6,000 horsepower day after day with minimal maintenance. They had a maximum speed of 120 miles per hour and a tractive effort of 61,568 pounds. Very, very good. They were so good that when New York Central started considering switching over to diesel power, it actually put up the Niagaras against the diesels that were being offered to them as sort of a test run. Now, some will tell you that Niagara actually won this contest. That's not strictly true, but the results were extraordinarily close. The Niagara was actually better in some categories, the diesels better in others. And either way, it put the diesel salesmen in a really awkward position because they'd been talking up their product, and when it was actually tested, well, their product really wasn't any better than what the railway was currently using. However, the idea of the Niagaras actually being retained was hampered by other factors. There was a coal miners' strike for one, and their fireboxes were slightly flawed, requiring extensive maintenance to keep them going. As a result, they didn't even last 10 years. They were all scrapped by 1956, and that was mostly due to... oh, here we go again. Boys, where on earth is that last Niagara? Oh no, not again! Leave the Niagaras alone, man! I am your boss. You will tell me where it is hidden, so that I, Alfred E. Perlman, can destroy her personally. Can't we just donate one to a museum? Please? Just one, that's all I'm saying. Never. They're worth $15,000 in scrap value. We can't just let that money go to waste. I think we can afford just one. I think that's fair. Are you going to pay for it? You do not pay me nearly enough to... Exactly! Why don't you just take a hit on your own paycheck? I mean, you get paid more than anybody else. That's ridiculous! How dare you mention that, Barry? Now where on earth is she? What is your fixation with destroying steam engines, boss? You don't understand what they've done over the years. They chug and they chug. And the more they chug money out of the pockets of innocent people. Innocent people. Innocent people! The diesels. They would never do that. Yeah, diesels don't cost any money to operate. Exactly! You see my point. And that is why I will never cease until every steam locomotive on this plane is annihilated. And, wait. Are you boys in a steam engine? Oh no. Oh, so this is a steam engine. Barry! I want that steam engine! Barry, quick! Light the firebox! What's a firebox? The Pennsylvania Railroad Class T1. My favorite locomotive, except perhaps for the S1 and the S2, because I like those two a lot. Anyway, the T1 is an exciting piece of steam technology. Built by Altoona Works as well as Baldwin, 52 of these were produced, and these are duplexes. 4 steam locomotives. The T1s were notorious for being highly advanced for their time. Just the technology that went into them made them extremely impressive, to the point that New York Central briefly considered modifying a Niagara into a duplex in an attempt to compete with them, as they were worried about them. These things had colossal power, with a tractive effort of 64,653 pounds, a total horsepower of 6,500, and a maximum speed that was over 110. It's unknown how fast they could really go, as some technicians said they observed them operating at speeds as high as 143 miles per hour. That's 230 kilometers per hour, which of course would have smashed Mallard's record if it was considered official. It's not considered official, but the point is, these things were highly impressive. Now, they were complex, making their maintenance levels extremely high, and they were so good at producing power, they were actually a little obnoxious to control by the crews. They were described as free steaming, which means they could generally maintain boiler pressure regardless of the throttle setting, and most of the engineer's job was keeping them from going too fast. Their power was such that wheel slip was an issue on them, but this seems to have more to do with the crews not really having the time to get used to them, as they weren't in service for very long. If they had adjusted their methodology, it's likely the T1s could have evolved to be one of the greatest locomotives ever produced by any railway, but sadly they weren't given that chance. Most of the class was built between 1945 and 1946, and they were gone by 1956. Some of them didn't even last 10 years, not because they were bad, but because the Pennsylvania Railroad decided to dieselize. The T1s had already been downgraded in 1948 just to haul secondary trains, and they were actually all out of service in general by 1952. Some sat around for a while, yeah, but they all wound up being scrapped without a single one being donated or sold to a museum somewhere. There is some hope for this type, as I've mentioned before. A non-profit group known as the T1 Trust has begun constructing an all-new, fully operational T1 using the original plants, and slight performance improvements, not that they apparently needed them. The new locomotive is going to be numbered 5550, and they're hoping to finish it by the year 2030. They're hoping to use her for mainline excursion service, and worst case scenario, she can actually be in a museum. Though she won't be original, of course, well, it's still a T1, and it'll be nice to have one back on the lines again after so long. Like I said, they just never had a chance to shine. But perhaps, within another decade, we might actually be able to see one. The British Rail Standard Class 6. Ugh. You know, I can't even get mad, because the last few top 5s I've done, people have been like, yeah, but where's British Rail? I didn't realize you guys enjoyed my suffering that much. Well, here they are. Again, hello. Say hi to everybody. Get out of here! Standard Class 6s, sometimes just called the Clan Class, were 462 Pacifics, designed by Robert Riddles, for use on, yes, British railways. Built between December of 1951 and March of 1952, only 10 were actually made. These locomotives weren't necessarily considered perfect, but it seems to be down to how they were used, not they themselves being inherently bad. Crews that used them regularly and understood their quirks liked them quite a lot, but some that didn't use them regularly found them to be a bit difficult to steam. But part of that problem seems to be down to the fact that they were allocated to Class 7 work, when they were, well, Class 6s. That's a power classification. They were trying to make them pull trains that they just weren't designed to pull. So I think history's been kind of unfair to them in a way, because when they were given a role that they were meant for, they actually performed quite well. It's believed that if proper investment came to giving them modifications, their poor steaming characteristics probably would have been overcome, as their construction had also been rushed, so their build quality wasn't necessarily the greatest. In their design form, they should have been fine. There was a proposal for a second batch of them, but the modernization plan prevented that, and withdrawal of the class started in 1962. Two of them, number 72006 and 72008, managed to last until 1966 before they were finally withdrawn, and every single one of them wound up being scrapped, rendering it extinct. But there is a plan to revive them, much like the T1. A registered charity, known as the Standard Steam Locomotive Company, is constructing a new locomotive that would have been the first of the uncompleted batch of 15 way back when, number 72010, Hengist. Since these were a standard class, many of their parts are actually shared by other preserved locomotives, and they can be cast pretty easily, a lot cheaper than you'd expect. So it's entirely possible within a few years, we might actually see another Class 6 on the rails. Don't have a time frame for you exactly how long that's going to be, but someone is working on it. So, much like the T1s, the Class 6s might be revived one day. And, well, we can hope. The New South Wales D58 Class. This class of locomotive was constructed by the New South Wales Government Railways in Australia. They're 482s, which are classically called mountain types, and they were technically just a modified version of the preceding D57 class. The changes to it were meant to help it run on lines that had a tighter loading gauge, such as the main North Line to Broadmeadow. It used a rack and pinion valve gear, which is weird for the middle cylinder, and used smaller cylinders in general. They also used a Woodard divided drive of twin coupling rods between the second and third driving wheels. And given they were pretty big by Australian standards with very large fireboxes, they also included a mechanical stoker, which was nice. They first entered service in March of 1950, and only 13 wound up completed, because during the same time, the railway decided to move to diesel power, which did not bode well for the D58s. But even if they didn't do that, they honestly didn't turn out as great as they'd hoped. On paper, that rack and pinion valve gear should have been superior, but in practice, it required a lot more maintenance and lubrication to keep it going. This increased operating costs. To make matters worse, smaller diameter cylinders of the 58s demanded a later cutoff, and that used more steam, making them really uneconomical compared to the preceding 57s. But to be fair, if it was used on the lines it was meant to, it actually did alright. It just almost never was used on those lines. They were mainly used on the main western line to Lithgow instead, and they didn't even last 10 years. They were all withdrawn by July of 1957 and scrapped by March 1964. However, a few of their tenders are still hanging around. The one that belonged to 5808 lies near Canberra Station, which was converted to an old fuel tank for a diesel shunter. Another is actually at the Dorrigo Steam Railway and Museum. And their preceding sister class, the D57s, do have a surviving example. Number 5711 managed to survive into preservation, and is currently being statically restored at the Valley Heights Locomotive Depot Heritage Museum. The MAV Class 601. This is a Hungarian locomotive, a 4-cylinder Malay, and they, for their time, were enormous, big, chungus. They were actually nicknamed the Giant or, get this, Big Boy. Yes, really, they called them Big Boys before the American Big Boys. 601s weren't quite as big as the more famous American Big Boys, but for their day, they were pretty friggin' big. They were 22.5 meters long and could produce 22,000 kilowatts of power. They were the largest and most powerful steam locomotives in Europe prior to and during the First World War. As 2660s, their power allowed them to move much heavier freight trains than any other locomotive could on their own. Trains were getting longer in Europe, especially during the war, and that extra power was needed. A total of 60 were actually produced, so you'd think at least one might scrape by and be preserved, but sadly, no. Not a single one of these incredible locomotives survived into preservation. Based on what I can tell, they were all scrapped by the mid-20th century. The Baltimore and Ohio Class EM-1. The EM-1s were a group of 30 Baldwin-built 2884s. These were Yellowstones, simple articulated steam locomotives, and they appear pretty late on the scene in terms of the steam age, being built and put into service during World War II. At the time, B&O was actually interested in dieselizing and didn't want to buy any new steam locomotives, but during World War II, it was difficult to actually get a hold of any new diesel locomotives. Production had been minimized due to the war effort, so they just went with new steam locomotives. They were, despite of course being very, very large steam locomotives, technically the smallest Yellowstones built. But overall size, of course, isn't everything. Not only were they considered a very handsome class of locomotive, but they were also extremely reliable. They were very, very, very good. Despite being forced to buy them, B&O was happy with them. So happy that they actually plan on preserving at least 2 of the 30 that had been built. But given the fact they're on this list, you probably know where this is going. The first in the class, number 7600, was already earmarked for preservation by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. That makes sense, it's the first in the class, and a good representation of her sisters. She was sitting at Benwood Junction in West Virginia, and she was about to be moved to the museum, but a yardmaster, who completely misunderstood why she was being moved, thought she was supposed to be scrapped. So he ordered her to be taken to the scrapyard and broken up. This was insanely infuriating for everybody else involved, because the people who had saved her actually worked hard to doll her up and make sure she was ready for display, which she was. And then she was cut into pieces. By the time Baltimore and Ohio's management had realized what had happened, it was too late for them to do anything about it. 7600 was gone. Though, for what it's worth, they absolutely fired the heck out of the yardmaster for being a moron. Number 7609 was also supposed to be preserved, and she was actually offered to the city of Wheeling, West Virginia, for static display. A lot of cities, especially when a class is associated with them, are offered one whenever they're retired, as a nice display piece for tourists and residents alike. Anyway, Wheeling said no, so they scrapped her, which just seems like such a waste. I mean, I get it, they're very large, you would need to find space for, but come on! This is definitely a far more frustrating story than I care to admit. Whenever a company just casually decides to scrap a whole class, I mean, that's annoying, but it's not surprising. But in this case, B&O tried to save at least 2 of them, and due to various reasons, they were lost anyway. It's just disappointing. The Furness Railway K2 Class. These quirky little engines were a group of 8 440 steam locomotives. The class would technically be called an American, but these are, well, Scottish. They were built by Sharp Stewart and Company of Glasgow for the Furness Railway, 6 of them in 1896, and then 2 more in 1900. They were meant to supersede the 120 class on heavier trains. They weren't necessarily large or grand, but they were very good in their day, and did solid work for many years, well into the 1920s. If they look a little familiar, well, that's because these guys are actually the basis for my favorite Thomas the Tank Engine character, Edward, the Blue Engine. Edward is just the goodest boy on that railway. I mean, let's be fair, Edward is just such a wholesome character. I love his story arcs. But sadly, outside of Edward, safe on the island of Sodor, all of his siblings would be destroyed. There were only 8, like I said, and they were withdrawn between 1929 and 1931. The Victorian Railway's S-Class. They were a class of 462 express passenger steam locomotives operated by the Victorian Railways in Australia between 1928 and 1954. And the S's wound up being the most prestigious locomotive class until diesel electrics would come along. But, well, you knew that was coming. They were actually the first Pacific types on the VR, as well as the first 3-cylinder locomotive type. They were powerful and very fast, reducing travel time on any lines they worked on. They were probably most famous for the Spirit of Progress, the premier express passenger train on the Victorian Railways. They were streamlined to pull this particular set of coaches, and they were instantly recognizable as a result of the distinction. They were also fitted with long-range tenders, and even though they only ever had 4 of these, they've utilized them heavily. They ran annual mileages double that of any other class of locomotives on Victorian railways, and by 1954 had run a combined total of approximately 5,700,000 miles. That's 9,200,000 kilometers. They were such an impressive piece of locomotive technology, able to accomplish a level of work that would have taxed almost every other kind of locomotive that VR had. And yet, sadly, all of the S's, well, are gone. They were, in fact, the very first casualty of Victorian Railway's dieselization program. The transition began very quickly when the B classes were delivered in 1952. The S classes already had some limited utility due to their high axle load, and their maintenance costs, due to their age and really high mileage, were getting outlandish, so the commissioners sought to withdraw them from service and scrap all of them as their mechanical condition dictated. The first one to go was S301 in September of 1953 due to her worn cylinders. She was scrapped just the following month. S302 and S303 were both scrapped in 1954, and the last to go was actually the first ever built, S300. She was withdrawn in June of 1954 and recorded as being scrapped 3 months later, on the 17th of September, 1954. This fact was actually absolutely infuriating to the preservationist movement down in Australia, so much so that it actually kick-started the whole thing into high gear. Due to them being just straight up gone, it surprised people, and got many who didn't care before suddenly involved in the preservation of these historic locomotives. The Australian Railway Historical Society even notes that the loss of the S-Class helped to galvanize railway enthusiasts into lobbying for the preservation of other locomotives, such as the X-Class, as well as the establishment of the Australian Railway Historical Society Museum. So, the death of the S's in particular helped save other locomotives in Australia who otherwise would have been lost. So that's something. And they were able to salvage some components of them. Their tenders were actually very large, and they found uses for them as tankers for weed spraying of the Victorian tracks. And their frames and bogies were sometimes converted into heavy-duty flat wagons. 2 of those tender frames were earmarked for preservation by the Newport Railway Museum, and they're actually currently being used as workshop vehicles at the Newport workshops. Another one is stored by Steam Rail Victoria, and the 4th is in the possession of Seymour Railway Heritage Centre. One of the S-Class's whistles also managed to survive, and when the Australian Railway Historical Society operated a 50th anniversary run of the Spirit of Progress on the 14th of November 1987, they fitted an R-Class locomotive, R707, with that whistle, so she could recreate the long-lost echo of the S-Class.